Okay, well, it should go without saying that we all watched the videos of what happened at Bondi Beach last Sunday with absolute horror and shock. People should never be at risk when they go to the beach, when they are enjoying themselves on a summer's afternoon, and when they're taking part in a religious event. And if it needs to be said, we will say it again, solidarity is in total opposition to terror attacks, to anti-Semitism, against all racism in all its forms. Racism is not just something that produces victims, it's also something that divides the working class. So central to the socialist project is opposition to racism in all its forms. And by the way, I should say, regardless of the politics of the people who were shot. Many of those people, the adults, not the children, were actually hardline right-wing Zionists. But we still condemn the shooting because racism is racism is racism. In the same way that when racists in the last couple of days threw pigs' heads into a cemetery, a Muslim cemetery, our starting point wasn't to say Sunni or Shia, progressive or conservative. Our starting point is to say disgusting racism, and we reject it. One thing I should say before we get into the meat of the talk is we're getting lots of pious talk from politicians and media about Australia shouldn't be like this. Well, let's have a reminder that Australia has actually always been like this. Between 1788 and 1930, there are 424 documented, confirmed massacres of 6 or more Indigenous people. So this country's normality was actually built on the blood of Indigenous people spilt on this continent. So I was speaking to a journalist earlier today, and he's about an event on Sunday, which now looks like it's going to be cancelled. Saturday, sorry. And he said, shouldn't you call this event off because people are mourning? And I said, why should we call off an event because people are mourning when every supporter of Israel is piling in to politicise this event to the eyeballs? We have the far right rallying in Sydney and Melbourne on Sunday, calling for the sacking of the government because the government has welcomed in terrorists and given them support. We've had Bob Katter coming out and saying that the government allowed these people into the country, and it's very clear who these people are. He's talking about Muslims first and foremost. The far right is making hay. That they are making an argument about terrorism coming from migrants, the disruption of normal life coming from overseas wars. And I think we obviously have to take those arguments on head on. They have consequences. I mentioned the pig's head. There's a Muslim school in the western suburbs of Melbourne that was graffitied. I don't know whether it was overnight or in the early hours of this morning. And people can report on the conversations they're having around them. But one of our comrades, Erima in Sydney, who's on the waterfront, has reported that she is now almost entirely isolated in her MUA workplace because people are now saying we have to get the terrorists, we have to get the troublemakers, and staunch unionists are beginning to circulate One Nation memes and posts. So the far right is going to do as much as it can. We're going to have to, in the new year, we're going to have to ramp up our anti-racist organising. We were already talking about that in the light of One Nation and Hanson, and that will become even more important. But in many ways, our biggest immediate problem is the mainstream politicians backed up by the media. So we've had Gillian Siegel, the anti-Semitism envoy, say that the horrors at Bondi were all because 300,000 people walked over the harbour bridge in the rain. We've had obviously Netanyahu and the other Israeli ministers say that Labour has been fostering anti-Semitism and the logical outcome is the massacre because Labour recognised Palestine, a very futile gesture in and of itself. And I think Frydenberg came out, Josh Frydenberg, the former Liberal Treasurer, not a politician now, but clearly steeped in the political world. He came out yesterday with a speech which said Albanese was to blame, and he made 7 demands on the government, and they included banning protests, no ifs, no buts. He didn't even say Palestine protests. Banning protests, prosecuting people for chants, and I suspect he's talking about globalise the intifada from the river to the sea, and implement the Siegel report in full. And the Siegel report is based on the implementation of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which essentially says criticising Israel beyond minor tish 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 type comments is an act of anti-Semitism, because Israel is the Jewish homeland. And what we've seen this afternoon, and I must admit I'm not across every detail at the moment, but we've seen Albanese completely cave into that agenda. He's announced a whole series of measures, crackdowns on visas. I think we can assume more deportations, crackdowns on so-called radical preachers, and to some extent, it's not completely clear, the implementation of the Siegel report. And the Siegel report means, for instance, that if you are a school, a museum, a theatre group, a university, any organisation that essentially gets public money, you have to sign up to that definition of anti-Semitism, and that means in turn that if you speak out around Palestine, you will probably lose your funding. It's an enormous attack on the ability to speak out publicly. So we need to be absolutely clear, when they talk about fighting anti-Semitism, what they're really talking about is taking a piece of 4x2 and smacking the Palestine movement around the head. This is an attack on everything we've done for the last 26 months in standing up against the genocide. It is an attempt to wipe away all the gains that we've made. And so all of us, the anti-racist movement, the Palestine movement, are going to face some tough challenges in 2026. I think our priorities are, in the first instance, to insist and try to win and re-win the argument that being opposed to Zionism is not anti-Semitic. I think our second argument, and they're of equal importance, is that the Palestinian movement is not to blame for what we saw happen in Bondi. So on the question of Zionism, I think we need to remind ourselves of a few basic facts. Judaism is an old religion, goes back thousands of years. It has with it multiple cultures, not just one. It depends whether you're an Arab Jew, a European Jew, or whatever. But it's essentially a religion encased in traditions and culture and so on, which makes it possible for me to be a cultural Jew, even though I'm an atheist. I'm not the only person in that situation. Zionism, on the other hand, is a reactionary ideology that was developed in the second part of the 19th century that established that argued that anti-Semitism was eternal and unchanging, and that Jews had to leave wherever they were living and go to Palestine to create a Jewish state. And the only way that was possible was by Zionism allying itself with imperialism. And over time they allied with different imperialists. And today, of course, number one, their ally is the United States. And the irony of all this is, of course, is that the focus on Zionism, on Israel as somehow being the home of the Jews, the solution for the Jews, actually encourages anti-Semitism in some quarters. Because if Israel and Jews are welded together, if all Jews support Israel and Israel is the home for all Jews, then if you look at the genocide that's been carried out for the last 2 years and all the other horrible crimes that have been committed by Israel, then by logic, these are crimes committed by Jews and all Jews are responsible. Now, thankfully, not everybody draws those conclusions, but enough people draw those conclusions for Zionism effectively to reinforce anti-Semitism, and I think we've seen at least an element of that in what happened at Bondi on Sunday. Now, the irony of all this is, while we are being abused and attacked, we, the left, the Palestine movement, abused and attacked for standing up for Palestine and being called anti-Semites, the Zionists are absolutely working hand in glove with bona fide anti-Semites. Because actually the Zionist project is not primarily about Jews, it's about a colonial settler nation state in Palestine. And that is the first and always has been the number one priority for Zionists. So to take one example, it was revealed a few weeks ago that people in the youth group of the Republican Party in the United States, and you can be in your 40s and in the youth group of the Republican, given that they have loads of senators who are in their 90s, I suppose it sort of makes sense. But it was revealed that in the chats amongst the youth so-called members of the Republican Party, there were people openly praising Hitler, calling out for the gassing of Jews. There was rampant and rancid anti-Semitism. And the response, for instance, of J.D. Vance, the Vice President, was to say, oh, it's just youthful mistakes, bad language or whatever, even though some of those people were in their 30s and 40s. Have you heard anything about Australia breaking links with the Republican Party, which rules the United States? It controls all three wings of the US government. Not a peep, not a peep. Anti-Semitic to the core, but not a peep. I think even more clear-cut is the fact that Israel invited Tommy Robinson to visit as an honoured guest in October. Just in case anybody in the room is not sure, Tommy Robinson is Britain's leading Nazi. He's on the record with anti-Semitic comments. He promotes the Great Replacement theory, which is that supposedly elites, and many of the people behind this theory basically say that the Jews are the elites, are flooding the Western world with brown people and black people and Muslims in order to destroy the white race. Tommy Robinson, if there is such a thing as a white race, which I don't think there is, Tommy Robinson has supported that, and he was invited to Israel by the Minister for the Diaspora. He spoke at an event in Tel Aviv, hundreds of people. One person stood up and said, "You're a racist, Tommy Robinson." That guy was beaten up and spat on. Beaten up and spat on in Israel for calling out a Nazi. And the minister, who goes by the name of Amichai Chikli, who is the Minister for the Diaspora, who organised the visit, said about Tommy Robinson, "He's a true friend of the State of Israel. He's a true friend of the Jewish people." Note how the two things are put together as one concept. We feel who is with us and who is not. It's as simple as that. So we have a situation where the Zionists are quite prepared to do business with anti-Semites if it's in the interests of Israel. So that same minister has gone to Europe. He's met with Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, who is an open anti-Semite, pushes the Great Replacement theory, uses the Jewish financier George Soros as a metaphor for Jewish finance domination. The minister and other members of the government have met with Marine Le Pen, who leads a fascist party, the National Rally in France. So they're very selective about when they choose to fight anti-Semitism and when they don't. And over again, fighting anti-Semitism is primarily, and we can see it right now happening in front of our eyes, about fighting the Palestine movement. And on Sunday, when Put Australia First marches against terrorists, the Lions of Zion, which is a Zionist group made up of former members of the IDF, will be there. They were there a few weeks ago, marching in lockstep with Pauline Hanson, and happy to be there while Tommy Robinson, by video, spoke to the rally. And one of the Lions of Zion spoke from the platform. Actually, they're not concerned about anti-Semitism. They're concerned about anti-Zionism. They're concerned about defending the Israeli project. Now, to move on to the question of the Palestinian movement, I think one thing we need to say up front is that if those two men who committed the atrocity on Sunday were indeed motivated by ISIS, which seems likely. There were flags found in their car. There's talk of a manifesto, although it hasn't yet appeared in public. If they were motivated by ISIS, we can be absolutely confident they had nothing to do with the Palestine movement, because ISIS is a profoundly reactionary movement born out of the despair of the collapse of Iraq after the invasion by the West, including by Australia, the attack on imperialism on the Middle East. But ISIS is not an anti-imperialist force. It's taken its anger and disaffection and turned it inwards against other enemies, against Shia Muslim, against LGBT people, against people from the left. I can guarantee that no ISIS supporter has come onto a Palestine rally in Melbourne. They would have left it well alone. They would regard it as a modernistic crime against their version of Islam. And therefore it is blatantly obvious that the Palestine movement had nothing to do with what happened on Sunday. We know that because all of us have been on the streets for more than 2 years. Maybe not every week, but over and over again. And we know we have never heard an anti-Semitic speech from the platform. We know that Jews have spoken from the platform. We know that Palestinians and their supporters are fighting imperialism and fighting against racism. And so for the Palestinian movement to be blamed is nothing but the most cynical opportunism by the right, an attempt to use the blood of the fallen at Bondi in order to win a victory over the Palestinian and anti-imperialist movement. And we have to insist that the genocide is at the root cause of these issues. We don't know exactly how the genocide and anti-Semitism led to those two men picking up guns and doing what they do. But what we do know is that the genocide fuels anger, it fuels outrage. Many of those people express that anger and outrage in a healthy and positive way by taking part in the rallies, the marches, the factory protests and all the rest of it that we've known so well over the last 26 months. But some people respond to the genocide by moving to the right towards anti-Semitism and obviously in some cases towards anti-Semitic violence and acts. And it's the genocide that constantly reinforces the idea, because Israel says so, that the Jewish state has the right to kill people, tens of thousands of people without consequence. And that blowback comes back onto Jewish people in the same way that in 9/11 in 2001, the Western invasion of the Middle East, the wars in the Middle East, the domination of the Middle East by the US, Britain and Australia, those led to a blowback when people flew planes into the World Trade Center and into the Pentagon. It wasn't a useful response, but it was a response that logically flowed from the crimes of imperialism. And I think that's the final thing I want to say is, just like 9/11, there is a crucial importance that we stand up and fight back against the right when it is demonising the Palestinian movement, when it is cracking down on the right to protest. Some of us remember what it was like in 2001. There was today, there was massive sympathy for the people in New York and Washington. There was massive outrage at the terrorism, etc., etc. Massive attacks on Muslims, and even people who weren't Muslims but looked Muslim were being attacked in the street. And we, as revolutionary socialists, had to lead the way and say, do not blame. Our enemy is not Al-Qaeda. Our enemy is imperialism. It's imperialism which has created the context in which 9/11 comes about. And that was a very difficult argument to make, but it was an argument that we made as soon as possible, and we stood our ground and we began to shift some people around us. And I think, just think more recently of the 7th of October. The immediate response was, Palestinian terrorists have killed people at a music event and all the rest of it. But the movement did the right thing. It went onto the streets and said, this did not start on the 7th of October. It started almost 100 years ago with the dispossession of the Palestinians. And so I think we have now the challenge to do the same job, to carry the argument into the movement that we should not be defensive, we should not be accepting the scapegoating of Palestinians, we should not be accepting the attacks on protest. I think we are not completely alone, but there is still a lot of nervousness out there. Some of you may be aware that there was a plan for a small gathering, come vigil, come speak out in Melbourne on Saturday. I can't confirm it, I will confirm it a little later on, but I would say at this point it's 99% certain that it's going to be cancelled. Not because people agree with the arguments of Siegel and Frydenberg and Albanese, but because they're scared. They're scared of being attacked physically, politically, and by workmates. And the only way we turn that around is by turning it around politically. And there is a real premium on politics now, more than I think for quite some time in the Palestine movement. We cannot build the movement just by saying, stop the genocide in Gaza. We now have to deal with a new set of quite complex arguments, and I think revolutionary socialists are particularly well placed to make and lead those arguments, which is why if we're going to build and rebuild the Palestine movement in the new year, we need more solidarity members.